This is the video lesson for human world geography, and we're gonna continue where we were in class and look at kind of major alliances because even with random borders, sometimes the borders don't matter, and it's agreements that we have with one another. So the objective is you're going to be able to summarize major alliances in the world and the influence they have on the world. So this is a little more interesting than it's like this is this kind of border and this is that kind of border. So um, hopefully you'll enjoy this a little more than just the boring border stuff. So your totally useless bit of information is that Montenegro had a concentration camp on it, and they turned it into a resort. So I don't know how you feel about that. If you think it's a good idea or maybe kind of a weird idea where people were being held against their will and just treating it like a resort. I think it's weird. I wouldn't stay there, but that's your totally useless bit of information. So let's talk about allies. So what does it look like? How are we gonna how do we interact with our allies politically? And so there's obviously economic alliances. So for instance, the European Union, that's one we talked about that and watched videos on the European Union where they have a the eurozone where everyone that's a part of the eurozone shares the euro, and then there's also the free borders agreement in the EU where you can travel everywhere within the EU except for islands. Islands are weird, obviously. And then you have NAFTA, again, North American Free Trade Agreement. This allows us to really trade with Canada and Mexico. And this is actually being tested now with all that's going on. I know recently, this last week, Donald Trump was talking about how we should only allow totally like necessary trade to go through the borders through the NAFTA agreement. So that is an interesting thing. And then there's OPEC, the Organized of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So this is just a economic alliance of like oil producing countries. So this is one of those things that you have to look out for because OPEC likes to bully countries into doing what they want sometimes by controlling if your country gets oil or not. And so that happened to us in the 1970s with the oil embargo and just having oil prices skyrocket to crazy amounts back then. So we had an oil shortage and a gas shortage. So my mom remembers this as waiting in line and like having a gas attendant pump gas because OPEC wasn't giving oil to the Americans, and that was all in the 1970s. So this is OPEC. So we can tell where most of the countries are. They're mostly here in the Middle East. And the thing is, these countries in the Middle East, most of the time, get along, except probably Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. They don't really get along. And then in the early 1990s, there was the Persian Gulf War where Iraq invaded Kuwait. So even though there's an economic alliance, that doesn't always mean that they're always friendly. Venezuela also being involved and Ecuador. These are kind of the outlier countries here, but most of the prominent people are here in the Middle East. So there's that. Also, I'm enjoying my John Madden, like, hey, here's this and this and this. So I am enjoying this feature on Loom. And so other alliance, there's the African Union. So the African Union um, is this huge block of countries in Africa that have like come together to kind of break the chains of colonialism from Europe and America and even parts of the Middle East that have taken over and excuse me taken over and really changed their stuff, and they're now promoting unity in Africa because a united Africa in their eyes is a good Africa and economically powerful. Then there's the Arab League. this is the cooperation between North Africa and the Middle Eastern countries. And if you ever see this, and this is a good note taking thing. So this is an actual term called MENA. MENA is the Middle East, North African countries. So if you ever see this kind of area, the Arab League, that's MENA. And then there's the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is just kind of all these former colonies, and they work together. So, like for instance, a whole bunch of like Jamaica, Canada, Australia, India to a degree, like all of these places are kind of part of the Commonwealth, as well as like smaller countries, like St. Kitts and just these countries out like Gibraltar. All these places are a part of the Commonwealth of Great Britain, and they kind of are together in a way, but also not. Like they don't have voting rights in Parliament or anything like that, but they do like having a big trading partner like Great Britain. So, um, this is just one of those things that it is a weird thing. It is a alliance, but it's a very weird alliance. It's kind of based on tradition. And so, on your assignment for this week, um, look. Oh, sorry. Look at these. Answer these two questions, okay? Make sure it's a fully thought out answer. Make sure you have some critical thinking in there, okay? Also, you have the UN and its agencies. We talked about the UN, so you have the WHO, who this is becoming a very important thing, where it's like, hey, the WHO is really coming out with guidelines on how to like interact with Corona and how to really combat this virus, and kind of helping with research and coordinating with other countries. So this supranational organization is actually now very relevant. And then there's UNESCO. If you remember from the assignment from last semester, UNESCO is essentially this educational wing of the UN, and it helps um, preserve cultural sites and kind of spread scientific knowledge to everywhere. So these are just kind of supranational um, organizations in the UN, and there's many more like disarmament and like um, there is the Security Council and just many more like ECOSOC, the Economic Social Committee that promotes economic growth, all that. Um, and then this big question: who controls the oceans? And it's like, who is in charge of the Pacific? Like, if a crime happens in the Pacific, what happens? And the question is kind of foggy, and it kind of goes to this UNCLOS, which is just it sets up international laws about the ocean, and it's just this weird kind of like hazy zone where it's like, okay, no one owns the ocean, but if something does go on, it goes to this kind of organization in the UN. And so there are like many things that stem from this. A lot of it started with the Vietnam War, where North Vietnam shot at American ships. And the thing is, there was a question is like, were they in northern Vietnamese or Viet Cong waters, or were they in international waters? And that was this huge dispute that eventually kind of led us to Vietnam. And there wasn't this united convention of the laws of the sea, which I just is this big title that I is just we have too many acronyms in the UN. Then there's territorial waters, so this is like 12 miles off the coast of your state. So 12 miles off of the coast of Texas is still the United States water, and then 200 miles off the coast, the state controls the resources. So 200 miles off the coast of Louisiana, if there's oil there, we own the oil. And then there's the high seas, and this is just anywhere that doesn't belong to anyone. That's beyond, that's 200 and 200 point like 0001 miles off the coast of any state. That's kind of this open water, no one owns it. So that is something that is very involved. And there's just this level of, hey, territorial waters, the EEZ, and then the high seas. And so you have all that. And so this is this diagram of it. So the EEZ, and then there's a continental shelf and all this. This just kind of has um, this good diagram. And then, so also discuss how would these rules cause conflict between states. I gave you an example of Vietnam. Look for another example. Look for a modern day one of like just look up on Google just close. Just look up this close, and then kind of look up like disputes recently. I bet you there's been several. So just look at it and just see what is involved. And so there are divisions with all of this. So there's the north south divide. And this is kind of an economic division between wealthy countries in the northern hemisphere versus kind of not so wealthy ones in the southern one. Not saying that all southern hemisphere countries are poor, because you have like Australia, New Zealand, you have South Africa, you have part like Brazil is partly in the southern hemisphere. Like you have all of these big countries like Argentina that are economically wealthy, but if you think about the northern hemisphere above the equator, you have Great Britain, Russia, China, um, France, UK, Italy, US, Canada. Like you can just list all of these countries that are like huge powerhouses in the world economy. And this is called the Brandt line. And so the Brandt line kind of shows you, let me see if I put, yeah, here's kind of the Brandt line where it shows you rich and poor, but this kind of, I like how it kind of is like, okay, like we're gonna just pick and choose who's above the line. So I think if we wanted to change the Brandt line, I would move it to this, cut it down, bring it here, and so include New Zealand and like Australia below the Brandt line, because it obviously it is south of the equator, but all of these countries south are kind of poor in some way, shape, or form. And then you have the east-west divide, and so this is like practically the Cold War, where you have the eastern side of the world and how they think compared to the west, like America and Western Europe. This is capitalism versus communism. If you look over in the western side of the world, if you go back, like if you draw the line right here, like through Berlin, where there's more communist countries over here than over here. So obviously there's two. There's Cuba right there and Venezuela right here that are communist, and then you have Vietnam, China. I'm trying to think. I'm drawing a. India is kind of communistic in some ways, but you have a very different idea in Eastern Europe. Also, the Soviet Union was obviously communist during this time, but not so much anymore. So this is the three world order. And so this is where you get first world, second world, third world, where it's like, oh, first world problems. It's like I didn't get my hamburger right, so I threw it away and ordered another one. Or third world problems, where it's like I don't have clean water. And then there's the second world, which is like everyone forgets the second world because the second world doesn't really exist anymore. Um, because the Soviet Union fell and China kind of opened up its borders in the 1970s, where it was just like, okay, this is new. And the first world is all of the blue countries. And so this was the free, anti communist, capitalistic world. And then they were fighting the second world. The second world being communist, being the Soviet Union, being kind of under this tyrannical rule. And then the third world was just people that were like being decolonized, or they weren't really affiliated in a whole lot of anything. It's like, we're just kind of staying out of this. So this is kind of this cultural divide between the East and the West. And you can kind of see it right here, where there's East and West Germany. And so you have the Western world and the Eastern world. This West East is very important because it just kind of shows you, if you look at all of these countries in the red, they're very highly developed. And then the Eastern world, they're still catching up because communism did a huge blow to the Soviet Union when it collapsed. China had to change up how they did communism to kind of be more like free market, kind of, where they traded with people instead of just not traded with anyone. And but like they're still developing. There's still problems like India, obviously, the Middle East. All this is just, they're still developing because of the aftermath of the Cold War. And so look at this. Oh, wait. Do not do this guy right here. I just don't want to do this. So don't do that. But do this. Like my start, it's fantastic. So don't just do the first one, not the second one on this slide, okay? Now colonies, like what about those other countries that we don't really talk about, that are kind of, as some people might think, they're insignificant? And colonies exist in colonialism. This was in the 1800s and 1700s, where Europe's like, hey, let's get all the resources that we can. And this is where Europe kind of became a powerhouse in the world because they developed guns and steel a whole lot faster than the rest of the world. And because of that, they were able to travel and colonize and take over. And so this was like this horrible thing. Like, but without colonization, we don't have America. We don't get Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Like, we don't get the cultures that exist there without colonization. So there is some give and take. And so why this is kind of your Spanish kind of thing from eighth grade U.S. history. It's God, gold, and glory. They wanted more colonies because it meant more power. They wanted gold because they wanted like a workforce or market that had all these resources. And then they also wanted to promote Christianity. They wanted to spread the gospel because it's like you had this call in the Bible. It's like, hey, make like disciples of all the nations. And that they're like, yeah, we have ships, we have guns, we have priests. Let's go do this. And so they're like, hey, be a Christian or die. That was kind of their main motto. And so you can see there are the effects of colonies today. Obviously, if you look, Spain took over Latin America. And that's why Spanish is the most spoken language across the world, because Latin America, like Central and South America, mostly spoken by, mostly colonized by Spain. And then Portugal got Brazil and parts of Africa. The UK went everywhere. It's just like the sun never set. And then France kind of had Southeast Asia and West Africa, which, if you look at West Africa, it's kind of a little deserty. So France kind of got not a whole lot, and then Portugal, Portugal, Spain, and the UK kind of got the rest of the world. And then most countries after World War II started saying, hey, we want our independence. And this was this end of imperialism, this building of empires, because we were just so tired, like the European powers were so tired of after World War II. It's like we just World War One was fought over kind of imperialism and just nation building, and then World War Two it's kind of the same thing a little bit, where it's like we're gonna have these little puppets fight each other all across the world, and it just like it was too hard. And so after that, they're like, okay, we'll let you have your independence, but we're gonna superimpose these boundaries. So, for instance, like Iraq is a big hodgepodge of stuff where it should not, if we were able to draw today the boundaries of Iraq, it would look very different because usually countries are based on culture and not really these boundaries that ignore the cultural patterns. And so you have like Sunni Shia splits in countries where you played one against the other. And then also in Hotel Rwanda, you had the um, Hutus and the Tutsis um, kind of being together, and even though they didn't like each other, so you had all that going on. So these were these superimposed boundaries, and because of colonialism, a lot of these are like all of these conflicts that are happening in the Middle East and in Africa are kind of a shout, like a callback to how colonialism kind of messed them up a little bit because they didn't want these borders. And so look at this, and what do you think this political cartoon from 1884 is trying to say? Answer that in your kind of Google Doc that you make. And then in 1914, this is kind of what everything looked like. Like if you follow these countries, it's like purple, all of this. Pink is the UK. They owned all that, all this. And there's very few countries that aren't owned by people. And so it's kind of this very interesting part of like world history where it's like, okay, we're going to try to take everything. And so colonies today, there's only 68, and they're mostly islands. And so they're kind of like these are still kind of based on like, hey, this is part of our colonies, and they never wanted independence because they're like, hey, we're okay with this agreement as long as we tweak the terms. And then there's kind of colonies like Greenland's a kind of a colony, and then China has some administrative regions like Hong Kong and Macau. These places are kind of administrated in a very weird way. Hong Kong kind of had this freedom for a little bit, and then this is what's going on in Hong Kong right now, or at least like last year, where these protesters were fighting for their freedom and wanting all of this freedom that they had, and the Chinese government's like, no, we don't. We're going to suppress that. And so, discuss this. Puerto Rico doesn't want to be a colony anymore, and so should they be incorporated as a state, given sovereignty, or stay this weird colony type thing? Because they're a part of the United States, but they don't have representation. They're in Congress, but they don't have voting power. And so, should they be a state? Should they be their own country, or should they stay this weird kind of middle where they are their own independent place, but they're also kind of part of America? So answer that. There's this video. Watch that on your own. I put the links in the PowerPoint so you can get it. And then nation states and ethnicities. So 20th century is a huge time where being ethnic is important. Like being like, for instance, two world wars kind of started because the Germans were like, hey, we want all the ethnic Germans to be together, or hey, we want this area because ethnically they're this or ethnically they're that. The USSR were kind of like, hey, there's no ethnicities. we're just all communists. And that's even to a point not great, because even the Jews during Stalin's turn was just like, hey, like, let's just get rid of all these Jews because they're obviously living this religious life and not this communistic life. And then there's the resurgence of folk culture coming on now, where people are starting to kind of look at their countries and like, hey, what makes me Polish? What makes me like Rwandan? What makes me Saudi? What makes me American? And we're looking at what our folk or what our local cultures are. And that is kind of this huge thing that's happening in America. The USSR, very interesting place because it's massive. Like, obviously, this is Europe over here. This is Europe over here, and it covered that. It also had this little yellow part right here, here, and here, and the red was Russia. And so since then, it's like this: the yellow part has fallen, and they're their own independent countries, but they're also kind of today's Russia is trying to take over some of these places again. And so, satellite states, these were kind of buffer zones after World War II, where it's just like, hey, we don't want, we want to put this iron curtain, as Churchill said, this iron curtain has descended on Europe. And this little border right here was this buffer zone so people wouldn't, that these people wouldn't like come in. Like, if the West ever wanted to invade, they would have to go through all these countries, and it would give time for Russia to kind of prepare for war. And then there's separatism. And so these are these places, like if you look at Yugoslavia and Albania, they were aligned until like 1948 and 1960. They were a part of the USSR, and then they wanted their own independence. They wanted to transfer the power to the local government and not to this national central government of the USSR. And then there's core areas where you have um, cultural, political, and economic, and that's kind of where they wanted that to be. They wanted their countries to be the core area and not Moscow. They wanted Albania, Yugoslavia. They wanted those areas. But also, you had a multi-core state where, if you look, you had these different places, and obviously, you needed to have these political areas of each place. For instance, even though this is a part of the Soviet Union, all this, these Eastern Bloc members, they in the Olympics, they were all their own. They were all their own countries that represented themselves, and so they were like the Soviet Union's kind of a multi-core state. The United States kind of a multi-core area where it's like Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, Austin are all these core areas where you have our independent cultures and political ideas, and it mixes together and it forms a big state. And so Texas is a multi-core state, and the United States is a multi-core state as well, because we have 50 states that represent 50 different economic ideas, cultural ideas, political ideas. And so you can look at that as that way, or um, you can look at it as it's like we're all one kind of monolith because we have the federal government. It's an interesting give and take. And then there's forward capital. And so this is where sometimes we want to change the capital. And so Brazil is known for this. They changed their capital a couple times, and they moved it from the coast to the interior. And this undermined regionalism, where it's just like, hey, we identify more with a region than the country. Kind of like how we have the federal government, where we have Washington, D.C., which is our capital, which is not a state or anything. It's just this little district that isn't involved with anything. And sometimes we want we have regionalism where it's like, hey, I identify as a Texan more than an American. And sometimes like, hey, I view myself more as someone from Dallas than from Fort Worth. And then there's the frontier where it's like this area where borders are shifting and are weak. This is kind of this weird thing. We don't have a whole lot of this in America, but say in Brazil where you have the Amazon rainforest and you have this frontier where it's like there's not a clear line because it's all the Amazon rainforest. There's not like a border security point there, and that's where it's like you don't really know where it is. Or in Saudi Arabia has this desert. Where do you draw the line? Like you can't really live in the middle of the desert. So this frontier is weird where like Yemen and Oman are, and it's like where does that stop and where does Saudi Arabia begin? And so also watch this Cold War video and then discuss how do we see the legacy of the colonization and Soviet rule in international politics today. Look at that. It is very interesting to see because there are huge um, echoes from the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And then summarize, describe the motivations for forming colonies, and then explain how colonialism still affects the world today, and use two examples. And so we'll continue this next week. But if you have any questions, email me. I will post more stuff on um, Google Classroom. But I'm sorry this video kind of came out late. I had some internet problems over the weekend, so here for you. But yeah, if you have any problems with this, just let me know, okay? Hey, I miss y'all, and I hope everything's going okay with you. I will see you when I see you, okay? Bye.